Join me in this deep dive for downward facing dog pose or Adho Mukha Svanasana to gain a better understanding of how to do this pose and how to make adjustments to make it work in your practice. If you are going to do this with me, please make sure you do a few warming exercises before we get started to open up your shoulders and your hips, and as well as your ankles and your wrists. And then at the very end, please make sure you do some stretches to counter all the work that we are going to do while we explore these different cues. I'm Christiana with Christiana's Yoga. I'm a certified yoga teacher, and I firsthand know that all of the different cues that come from all of the different teachers that we have can be pretty confusing. And because yoga classes are usually timed or due to the flow of the class, there's not a lot of time in order to give detailed cues. So often, the instructions to get in and out of downward facing dog are watered down to just a few basic instructions. And so in this video, I want to demonstrate the downward facing dog with the cues from a few different teachers, such as my yoga teacher training, Anodea Judith, and Mark Stevens. And I will also reference my Science of Yoga book and a couple of tips from Jenni Rawlings Yoga. And this way you should be able to gain some helpful instructions and cues that you can use in your practice, no matter how downward facing dog is cued in the classes that you're taking. So I've got all of my notes and my books here to keep me on track, and it seems exceptionally loud here today. So I've got my Bluetooth headphones in, and hopefully that will help with some sound quality, help increase sound quality anyways. So let's get started. For starters, we're going to go through the cues from my yoga teacher training. And then once we go through the cues from each teacher, afterwards, I want to pull together all of the cues that were the same and then point out some of the things that each teacher said differently, and then talk about any modifications and adjustments you can use to play with the pose and really make it your own so that you know how to do it and flow in and out of it no matter what. So, from my yoga teacher training, the instruction is to come to tabletop position. It doesn't clarify the positioning in tabletop position, so I will do that here. It's your knees are hips distance apart and your hips stacked directly above your knees with your wrists directly below your shoulders and your low belly gently hugged in. From here, back to the instructions of my YTT, spread your fingers wide and press through your thumb and forefinger. Engage the core. Inhale, tuck the toes, lift the knees up, straighten your legs or slightly bent, lengthen tailbone up towards the sky. Feet hip or shoulder distance apart. Engage the quads. Biceps frame ears. So already I need my knees bent here because I don't have that much stretch in the backs of my legs. Biceps frame the ears and lower heels towards the mat. Draw shoulder blades down your back. Keep your neck relaxed. Gaze towards your ankles. So that is the step-by-step how-to from my yoga teacher training. And I can feel in my body that I need to make some adjustments for this position. So I'm going to come out of this now. Bend my knees and come down. So next, I want to go through the cues from Anodea Judith. And she starts out the same way. In tabletop position. Set up the same. Spread fingers wide. Pointers parallel. So in order for my pointer fingers to be parallel, I have to rotate my hands out just slightly with your wrist creases parallel to the top of the mat. Engage your legs by tucking your toes onto the mat and pushing feet and hands into the floor. Firm your shoulder blades, drawing them downward. Feel this engagement with the ground before lifting the hips. I really like that cue, actually. Lift hips to form a triangle with the floor as the base. That's a fun cue that kind of tells me to create more length in my spine. Option to pedal your feet to wiggle into the pose. And that means bending into one knee and straightening the other leg and alternating That's a good way to really warm up the backs of your legs too and start to open up your hamstrings. Then the next cue is feet hips distance. Press your heels down towards the mat, but they don't have to reach. And that's the end of the instructions there, but then she goes on to offer some guidelines. So press hands and feet firmly into the floor as if trying to lengthen mat from top to bottom to energize the pose. Distribute weight evenly among the four corners, which would be both of my hands and both of my feet. Notice how this rooting action energizes the body. Legs. Hug muscles in towards bones. That means engage the muscles of your legs. Lift your kneecaps, which is a fun way of telling you to engage your quadriceps. Press front thighs toward the back, creating more space in the pelvic floor and widening the back of the sacrum. In the arms, press into the pointer and the thumb, or index finger and thumb, while giving a slight inner rotation of your forearms. Simultaneously, outwardly rotate upper arms, opening the shoulders and the chest. Soften the heart as you extend from the heart to the wrists and heart to pelvis. Then I'm going to come down to this next part here. She goes on to say to be wary of hyperflexion in the shoulders. So I might be able to demonstrate that a little bit in puppy pose, where instead of the upper body from the hips to the hands being in a straight line, the chest sinks down a little bit more, and this can happen with students that are really flexible. So it says, ideally, your torso should be in a straight line from your hips to your wrists. And then one thing that she does continue on to say, which I really like, is to experiment with bending and straightening knees, rising up on your toes. Let me go ahead and do that. So bending and straightening knees, rising up on your toes, and then letting your heels sink back down towards the mat. And then bending and straightening your arms too. To experience different dynamics in this pose. And those are all really fun ways to get a different experience in downward facing dog. And then the last one is Mark Stevens from actually my Teaching Yoga Essentials book here. In this particular example, he starts with, for beginners or somebody with low back issues, to start in all fours. So press to all fours, tuck your toes, lift your hips up and back while working to straighten the legs. There is an option to lift directly up and back into down dog and then rolling over the feet, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. But press firmly into entire hands and through fingers, rooting knuckle of index finger to balance the pressure in the wrist. Press away from the mat. Fingers spread wide, middle fingers parallel. My fingers are parallel. And I lost my spot. And in line with shoulders. Spread your fingers wide, but bring your thumbs in about 2/3 of the way to protect the space between your thumb and your pointer finger. Shoulder blades rooted against the back ribs and spread away from the spine. Root into the balls of your feet. Feet are hips distance or wider. Lengthen the spine by firming the thighs. Press the tops of the femur bones strongly back. Slightly spiral inner thighs back. And then relax your neck and allow head to hang until strong enough to hold head between arms with your ears in line with your arms. Light engagement of the belly. Steady gaze. Cultivate steadiness and ease. Then he goes on to explain some adjustments for people to make if there are certain things that you want to work against, like bent arms. And the cue for bent arms is to turn your hands out slightly. The hyperextended elbows, the cue here is to turn hands in slightly. And I do want to note here that in my Science of Yoga book, it does address this hyperextension. And the cue in this book is to squeeze your belly button in to engage your transverse abdominis to bring your low ribs and spine and pelvis closer to neutral. And then the other cue is to look for the middle fingers to see if they're parallel and in line with the shoulders for proper external rotation of the shoulders. So in this position, your palms may lift, the inner palms may lift, and the cue for that is to internally rotate your forearms and then press into the index finger and thumb. For knees that hyperextend, mine do not, so I can't demonstrate this one, but for knees that do slightly hyperextend, it's good to keep a bend in the knees. The next cue is to, if you can't straighten your legs, you do have the option to step your feet wide of the mat and also knees bent or straight. Oh, I forgot. I did not demonstrate the cue to or lift hips directly back up into down dog. So still starting in all fours, okay, without tucking the toes. So there's an option to press the mat away from you, engage your core, send your hips directly back and up, and you can either flip over both toes at the same time, which is very challenging for me, or one at a time. So now let's take a look at the cues that were the same throughout the instructors. And the very first cue is to start in tabletop pose. That is a very good beginning tip or beginning place to start in order to move into downward facing dog pose. And then hands in line with shoulders, so it was consistent across the board. Fingers spread wide and then rooting into the thumb and the pointer or index finger. And let me explain the cue to bring the thumb in. So when we spread our fingers wide, we usually spread them to the max. Well, this space between the thumb and the pointer finger can be a little tender sometimes. So in order to not overstretch that space, there's a recommendation to bring the thumb in about 2/3 of the way. And that's what that cue is all about. So while we're maintaining the full stretch of all the fingers, just bring the thumb in slightly. Then the cue for the shoulder blades is very commonly cued to draw them down your back. And specifically with Mark Stevens, draw them down your back, meaning when you're pressing away from you, draw them down your back, and then the cue to spread them away from your shoulders. And in a lot of classes, it's often cued like you're trying to close your armpits. And this is where that action can sometimes cause your inner palms to lift. And so there's an additional cue to rotate your forearms and then press back into the thumb and index finger in order to create more stability and take pressure off of your wrist. Then the next cue, engage your core, tuck your toes, lift your hips or your tailbone back and up, engage your legs or firm your quads, lift your kneecaps. And Anodea Judith and Mark Stevens both reference pressing the tops of the thighs back in order to find more length in the spine. Legs can be straight or bent, and it's always a good cue in order to pedal the feet, especially if you're coming into the pose for the first time, because our hamstrings may not quite be ready to open up quite as far. The placement of the feet are hip distance or wider, with lengthening your heels towards the mat any amount. They don't have to reach. And then the last cue is of the neck to relax it. Across the board, every cue is to relax the neck. But in addition, my Science of Yoga book addresses it, as well as Mark Stevens, to say that, yes, you can relax your neck and hang your head down towards the mat. Or once you develop the sufficient strength in the back of your neck, then you can lift your head to bring your ears in line with your biceps. That's a really good thing to practice, especially if you're working on building strength in the back of your neck and shoulders. The differences, though, for Anodea Judith, she cues that the pointer fingers should be parallel. And when I place my pointer fingers parallel to each other, that creates a slight rotation of my hand and then gets a little confusing when you have to keep your wrist creases parallel to the top of the mat. Then Mark Stevens recommends middle fingers parallel and then the thumb brought in 2/3, which we did talk about. As far as gaze, though, there's only two that mention it, and they're not very specific. My yoga teacher training says that the gaze is towards ankles or toes, and then Mark Stevens says steady gaze. But other than that, the examples that I have here don't really specify where you should be looking. And then, of course, the legs, the cue to spiral your inner thighs back, which was from Mark Stevens. So up in the pose, there's a cue to think of your inner thighs rotating in and back in order to create more length in your spine. So my thinking is, with the exception of issues and injuries, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I think we should spend less time micromanaging the placement of our hands or whether or not our pointers or middle fingers are parallel, where exactly to place our shoulders or the distance between our feet and our hands or how far apart we step our feet. Instead, I agree with what Jenni Rawlings says about our bodies know how to arrange themselves and to trust that and not micromanage the placement of our shoulder blades, but instead focus on muscular engagement. And I think that's pretty important. So overall, keeping the general shape in mind and then playing with it to find what works best for you in your practice and in your body is going to be what's most important. But here's some ways that you can do that. So Anodea Judith mentions bending and straightening your knees, which we demonstrated, rising on your toes and lowering your heels, or bending and straightening your arms. In the pose itself, your arms should be straight, but when you're playing around with it to get a different experience, you can see how it changes your relationship with gravity and what kind of effort that puts into your arms and your shoulders and other parts of your body too. And then Mark Stevens goes on to talk about how to counter certain things like straight arms and outwardly, if you're having trouble straightening your arms, to outwardly rotate your hands just slightly, or if your arms are hyperextended, to rotate them in just slightly. And a couple of other options here are to determine how far apart you want your hands and your feet. So you can step in closer, and Jenni Rawlings mentions that when you step in closer, it brings more of the stretch into your hamstrings, and then creates less work in your shoulders. Whereas if you step further back, the angle of your ankles becomes deeper and then creates more of a calf stretch and creates more work in your shoulders. So you can play with how far or close you want your feet in this position. And then the other options, of course, in the cues, you might have noticed that it says hips distance or wider when it comes to the placement of your feet. So if this isn't working for you, you can play with how far apart you step your feet. And Mark Stevens even mentions going as wide as your mat, possibly. So downward facing dog has quite a few benefits to it. And what it does is it stretches your entire back body from your calves all the way up through your hamstrings, your glutes, and your back. And then on top of that, it strengthens your entire front body because your quads are engaged, your belly is lifted, you're pressing the mat away from you and engaging the muscles in your front body. And then Anodea Judith goes on to mention that additional benefits is that the pose is grounding. It is very energizing. It's often referred to as a gentle warming pose for intermediate classes as well. But that it also improves digestion. But certain things to watch out for is if you have any knee issues or injuries, it's a good idea to not only practice carefully or cautiously, but keep a slight bend in your knees to help protect any discomfort that you already may have in your knees. And then if you have any issues on your wrists or injuries, then you may want to place some padding underneath your wrist. Let me fix that. If you're using a towel, make sure you fold it up nicely so that it's a stable surface for your wrists. Usually the folded edge is the best, most stable position to put pressure onto. But speaking of pressure, elevating your wrists can help release pressure in your wrist joints. So you can use the towel. I have a knee pad that I use sometimes, which is pretty helpful. And then a few other things to watch out for is the hyperflexion, which we talked about, late term pregnancy, carpal tunnel syndrome, high blood pressure, and headaches. With anything like that, it's always a good idea to practice carefully or talk to your physician first, but always make any adjustments or modifications that you can that work for your body. So you might have noticed that in the comparison of these three different teachers' instructions into downward facing dog, that we're all trying to get you into the same position, but we might just be saying it a little bit differently due to time or our own experiences or what we feel like we might need to highlight into the pose. But it is very helpful to have an understanding of the basic alignment foundations for the pose itself to get you into the general shape, but it's up to you to practice it and learn what works best in your body. And then you can move in and out of it with ease, no matter how the teacher cues it. If you found value in this video or if you have any thoughts you'd like to share, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Happy exploring and have a wonderful day.